Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories. Now, let's open our imaginations and begin. It's sweet to go with hound and hawk, o'er moor and mountain roamin'. It's sweeter to walk on the Solway side, with a fair maid at the gloamin'. But it's sweeter to bound o'er the deep green sea, when the flood is chafed and foamin', for the sea boy then has the prayer of good men, and the sighing of lovesome woman. The wind is up and the sail is spread, and look at the foaming furrow, behind the bark as she shoots away, as fleet as the outlaw's arrow. And the tears drop fast from lovely eyes, and hands are wrung in sorrow. But when we come back, there is shout and clap, and mirth both night and morrow. On a harvest afternoon, when the ripe grain which clothed the western slope of the Cumberland hills had partly submitted to the sickle, a party of reapers were seated on a small green knoll, enjoying the brief luxury of the dinner hour. The young men lay stretched on the grass. The maidens sat plaiting and arranging their locks into more graceful and seducing ringlets, while three hoary old men sat abreast and upright, looking on the sea of Solway, which was spread out with all its romantic variety of headland and rock and bay below them. The midday sun had been unusually sultry, accompanied with hot and suffocating rushings of wind, and the appearance of a huge and dark cloud, which hung like a canopy of smoke and flame over a burning city, betokened, to an experienced swain, an approaching storm. One of the old reapers shook his head, and, combing the remainder snow over his forehead with his fingers, said, "Woe's me! One token comes, and another token arises of tempest and wrath on that darkening water. It comes to my memory like a dream, for I was but a boy then groping trouts in Ellen water, that it was on such a day, some 50 years ago, that the bonny baby Allan of St. Bees was wrecked on that rock, o'er the top of which the tide is whirling and boiling, and the father and 3 brethren of Richard Faulder were drowned. How can I forget such a sea? It leapt on the shore among these shells and pebbles, as high as the mast of a brig, and threw its foam as far as the corn ricks of Walter Selby's stackyard, and that's a good half-mile." "I'se warrant," interrupted a squat and demure old man, whose speech was a singular mixture of Cumbrian English and border Scotch. "I'se a warrant, Willie, your memory will be rifer o' the loss of the lovely lass of Annanwater, who mailed keel upward on the hip of the Mermaid Rock and split her wameful of rare brandy into the thankless Solway. Faith, mickle good liquor has been thrown into that punch bowl, but fiend a drop of grog was ever made out of such a thriftless basin. It will aiblins be long afore such a good scent comes to our coast again. There was Saunders MacMichael was drunk between Yule and Yule forby." "Waes me, well I remember that doleful day," interrupted the third bandsman. "It cost me a fair son, my youngest and my best. I had 7 once, alas, what have I now? 3 were devoured by that false and unstable water. 3 perished by the sharp swords of those Highland invaders who slew so many of the gallant Dacres at Clifton and Carlisle. But the Cumberland Ravens had their revenge. I mind the head and long yellow hair of him who slew my son hanging over the Scottish gate at Carlisle. Aye, I was avenged, no doubt. But the son I have left has disgraced for ever our pure blood by wedding a border Gordon with as mickle gypsy blood in her veins as would make plebeians of all the Howards and the Percys. I would rather have stretched him in the church ground at Allenbay with the mark of a Hindleman's brand on his brow, as was the lot of his brave brothers, or gathered his body from among these rocks as I did those of my other children. But, oh, sirs, when did a man witness so fearful a coming on as yon dark sky forebodes?" While this conversation went on, the clouds had assembled on the summits of the Scottish and Cumbrian mountains, and a thick canopy of vapour which hung over the Isle of Man waxed more ominous and vast. A light, as of a fierce fire burning, dropped frequent from its bosom, throwing a sort of supernatural flame along the surface of the water, and showing distinctly the haven and houses and shipping and haunted castle of the isle. The old men sat silently gazing on the scene, while cloud succeeded cloud, till the whole congregating vapour, unable to sustain itself longer, stooped suddenly down from the opposing peaks of Crefel and Skredaw, filling up the mighty space between the mountains, and approaching so close to the bosom of the ocean as to leave room alone for the visible flight of the seamew and cormorant. The waterfowl, starting from the sea, flew landward in a flock, fanning the waves with their wings and uttering that wild and piercing scream which distinguishes them from all other fowls when their haunts are disturbed. The clouds and darkness increased, and the bird on the rock, the cattle in the fold, and the reapers in the field all looked upward and seaward, expecting the coming of the storm. "Benjamin Forster," said an old reaper to me as I approached his side and stood gazing on the sea, "I counsel thee, youth, to go home and shelter these young hares beneath thy mother's roof. The mountains have covered their heads, and hearken, too, that hollow moan running among the cliffs. There's a voice of mourning, my child, goes along the sea cliffs of Solway before she swallows up the seafaring man. 7 times have I heard that warning voice in one season, and it cries, 'Woe to the wives and the maids of Cumberland.'" On the summit of a knoll, which swelled gently from the margin of a small beck or rivulet, and which was about 12 yards apart from the main body of the reapers, sat a young Cumbrian maiden who seemed wholly intent on the arrangement of a profusion of nut-brown locks, which descended in clustering masses upon her back and shoulders. This wilderness of ringlets owed, apparently, as much of its curling elegance to nature as to art, and flowed down on all sides with a profusion rivaling the luxuriant tresses of the Madonnas of the Roman painters. Half in coquetry, and half in willingness to restrain her tresses under a small fillet of green silk, her fingers, long, round, and white, continued shedding and disposing this beautiful fleece. At length the locks were fastened under the fillet, a band denoting maidenhood, and her lily-looking hands, dropping across from each other in repose from their toil, allowed the eye to admire a smooth and swan-white neck which represented one of those natural and elegant sinuous lines that sculptors desire so much to communicate to marble. Amid all this sweetness and simplicity, there appeared something of rustic archness and coquetry, but it was a kind of natural and born vanity, a little of which gives a grace and joyousness to beauty. Those pure creations of female simplicity which shine in pastoral speculations are unknown among the ruddy and buxom damsels of Cumberland. The maritime nymphs of Allan Bay are not unconscious of their charms, nor careless about their preservation, and to this sweet maiden nature had given so much female tact as enabled her to know that a beautiful face and large dark hazel eyes have some influence among men. When she had wreathed up her tresses to her own satisfaction, she began to cast around her such glances, suddenly shot and as suddenly withdrawn, as would have been dangerous, concentrated on one object, but which, divided with care, even to the fractional part of a glance, among several hinds, infused a sort of limited joy without exciting hope. Indeed, this was the work of the maiden's eyes alone, for her heart was employed about its own peculiar care, and its concern was fixed on a distant and different object. She pulled from her bosom a silken case, curiously wrought with the needle. A youth sat on the figured prow of a bark, and beneath him a mermaid swam on the green silken sea, waving back her long tresses with one hand and supplicating the young seaman with the other. This singular production seemed the sanctuary of her triumphs over the hearts of men. She began to empty out its contents in her lap, and the jealousy of many a Cumbrian maiden, from Allan Bay to St. Bees Head, would have been excited by learning whose loves these emblems represented. There were letters expressing the ardor of rustic affection, locks of hair, both black and brown, tied up in shreds of silk, and keepsakes, from the magnitude of a simple brass pin watered with gold to a massy brooch of price and beauty. She arranged these primitive treasures and seemed to ponder over the vicissitudes of her youthful affections. Her eyes, after lending a brief scrutiny to each keepsake and symbol, finally fixed their attention upon a brooch of pure gold. As she gazed on it, she gave a sigh and looked seaward with a glance which showed that her eye was following in the train of her affections. The maiden's brow saddened at once as she beheld the thick gathering of the clouds, and, depositing her treasure in her bosom, she continued to gaze on the darkening sea with a look of increasing emotion. The experienced mariners on the Scottish and Cumbrian coasts appeared busy mooring and double-mooring their vessels. Some sought a securer haven, and those who allowed their barks to remain prepared them, with all their skill, for the encounter of a storm which no one reckoned distant. Something now appeared in the space between the sea and the cloud, and emerging more fully and keeping the center of the sea, it was soon known to be a heavily laden ship, apparently making for the haven of Allan Bay. When the cry of "A ship! A ship!" arose among the reapers, one of the old men, whose eyes were something faded, after gazing intently, said with a tone of sympathy, "It is a ship indeed, and woe's me, but the path it is in be perilous in a moment like this." "She'll never pass the sunken rocks of St. Bees Head," said one old man. "Nor whether the headland of Barnhoorie and the caverns of Colvend," said another. "And should she pass both," said a third, "the coming tempest, which now heaves up the sea within a cable's length of her stern, will devour her ere she finds shelter in kindly Allan Bay." "Good send," said he of the mixed brood of Cumberland and Caledonia, "since she maun be recked that she spills nae her treasure on the thankless shores of Galloway. Those northerns be a keen people with a ready hand and a clutch like steel. Besides, she seems a Cumberland mark, and it is meet that we have our ain fish guts to our ain sea maws." "Oh, see, see," said the old man, 3 of whose children had perished when bonny baby Allan sank. "See how the waves are beginning to be lifted up. Hearken how deep calls to deep, and hear and see how the winds and the windows of heaven are loosened. Save thy servants, even these seafaring men, should there be but one righteous person on board." And the old reaper rose and stretched out his hands in supplication as he spoke. The ship came boldly down the middle of the bay, the masts bending and quivering, and the small deck crowded with busy men who looked wistfully to the coast of Cumberland. "She is the Lady Johnstone of Annanwater," said one, "coming with wood from Norway." "She is the buxom Bess of Allan Bay," said another, "laden with the best of West India rum." "And I," said a third man, "would have thought her the mermaid of Richard Faulder. But," added he in a lower tone, "the mermaid has not been heard of nor seen for many months, and the Faulders are a doomed race. His bonny brigand here in the bottom of the sea, and with them sleeps the pride of Cumberland, Frank Forrester of Derwentwater." The subject of their conversation approached within a couple of miles, turned her head for Allan Bay, and, though the darkness almost covered her as a shroud, there seemed every chance that she would reach the port ere the tempest burst. But, just as she turned for the Cumbrian shore, a rush of wind shot across the bay, furrowing the sea as hollow as the deepest glen, and heaving it up masthead high. The cloud, too, dropped down upon the surface of the sea. The winds, loosened all at once, lifted the waves in multitudes against the cliffs, and the foam fell upon the reapers like a shower of snow. The loud chafing of the waters on the rocks prevented the peasants from hearing the cries of men whom they had given up to destruction. At length the wind, which came in whirlwind gusts, becoming silent for a little while, the voice of a person singing was heard from the sea, far above the turbulence of the waves. Old William Dacre uttered a shout and said, "That is the voice of Richard Faulder, if ever I heard it in the body. He is a fearful man, and never sings in the hour of gladness, but in the hour of danger. Terror and death are beside him when he lifts his voice to sing. This is the third time I have listened to his melody, and many mothers will weep, and maidens too, if his song have the same ending as of old." The voice waxed bolder and approached the shore, and as nothing could be discerned, so thick was the darkness, the song was impressive and even awful. It's merry, among the moonlight, when the pipe and the cittern are sounding, to rein like a war-steed my shallop and go o'er the bright waters merrily bounding. It's merry, when fair Allan Bay with its bridal candles is glancing, to spread the white sails of my vessel and go among the wild sea waters dancing. It's blithesomer still when the storm is come on, and the Solway's wild waves are ascending, in huge and dark curls, and the shaven masts groan, and the canvas to ribbons is rending, when the dark heaven stoops down into the dark deep, and the thunder speaks mid the commotion, "Awaken and see, ye who slumber and sleep, the might of the Lord on the ocean." This frail bark, so late growing green in the wood where the roebuck is joyously ranging, now doomed for to roam o'er the wild fishy flood when the wind to all quarters is changing, is as safe to thy feet as the proud palace floor, and as firm as green Skiddaw below thee. For God has come down to the ocean's dread deeps, his might and his mercy to show thee. As the voice ceased, the ship appeared through the cloud, approaching the coast in full swing, her sails rent and the wave and foam flashing over her mid-mast high. The maiden, who has already been introduced to the affection of the reader, gazed on the ship and, half suppressing a shriek of joy, flew down to the shore, where the cliffs, sloping backwards from the sea, presented a ready landing place when the waves were more tranquil than now. Her fellow reapers came crowding to her side and looked on the address and hardihood of the crew, who, with great skill and success, navigated their little bark through and among the sandbanks and sunken rocks which make the Solway so perilous and fatal to seamen. At last they obtained the shelter of a huge cliff which, stretching like a promontory into the sea, broke the impetuosity of the waves and afforded them hopes of communicating with their friends, who, with ropes and horses, were seen hastening to the shore. But, although Richard Faulder and his mermaid were now little more than a cable length distant from the land, the peril of their situation seemed little lessened. The winds had greatly abated, but the sea, with that impulse communicated by the storm, threw itself against the rocks, elevating its waters high over the summits of the highest cliffs, and leaping and foaming around the bark with a force that made her reel and quiver, and threatened to stave her to pieces. The old and skilful mariner himself was observed, amid the confusion and danger, as collected and self-possessed as if he had been entering the bay in the tranquillity of a summer evening, with 100 hands waving and welcoming his return. His spirit and deliberation seemed more or less communicated to his little crew, but chiefly to Frank Forster, who, in the ardent buoyancy of youth, moved as he moved, thought as he thought, and acted from his looks alone, as if they had been both informed with one soul. In those times, the benevolence of individuals had not been turned to multiply the means of preserving seamen's lives, and the mariner, in the hour of peril, owed his life to chance, his own endeavors, or the intrepid exertions of the humane peasantry. The extreme agitation of the sea rendered it difficult to moor or abandon the bark with safety, and several young men ventured fearlessly into the flood on horseback, but could not reach the rope which the crew threw out to form a communication with the land. Young Forster, whose eye seemed to have singled out some object of regard on shore, seized the rope. Then, leaping with a plunge into the sea, he made the waters flash. Though for a moment he seemed swallowed up, he emerged from the billows like a waterfowl and swam shoreward with unexpected agility and strength. The old mariner gazed after him with a look of deep concern, but none seemed more alarmed than the maiden with many keepsakes. As he seized the rope, the lily suddenly chased the rose from her cheek, and uttering a loud scream and crying out, "Oh, help him! Save him!" she flew down to the shore and plunged into the water, holding out her arms while the flood burst against her, breast high. "God guide me, Maud Marchbank!" cried William Dacre. "You'll drown the poor lad out of pure love." "I think," continued he, stepping back and shaking the brine from his clothes, "I am the mad person myself. A caress and a kiss from young Frank of Derwentwater is making her comfortable enough. Alas, but youth be easily pleased. It is, as the northern song says, contented with little and canty with mair, but old age is a delightless time." To moor the bark was the labor of a few moments, and fathers and mothers and sisters and sweethearts welcomed the youths they had long reckoned among the dead with affection and tears. All had some friendly hand and eye to welcome and rejoice in them, save the brave old mariner, Richard Faulder, alone. To him no one spoke, on him no eye was turned. All seemed desirous of shunning communication with a man to whom common belief attributed endowments and powers which came not as knowledge and might came to other men, and whose wisdom was of that kind against which the most prudent divines and the most skilful legislators direct the rebuke of church and law. I remember hearing my father say that when Richard Faulder, who was equally skilful in horsemanship and navigation, offered to stand on his grey horse's bare back and gallop down the street of Allanbay, he was prevented from betting against the accomplishment of this equestrian vaunt by a wary Scotchman who, in the brief manner of his country, said, "Dinna wager, Thomas. God guide your wits, that man's no canny." At that time, though a stripling of 17, and possessed strongly with the belief of the mariner's singular powers, I could not avoid sympathizing with his fortune, and the forlorn look with which he stood on the deck while his companions were welcomed and caressed on shore. Nothing, indeed, could equal the joy which fathers and mothers manifested toward their children, but the affection and tenderness with which they were hailed by the bright eyes of the Cumbrian maidens. "His name be praised," said one old man, to whose bosom a son had been unexpectedly delivered from the waves. "And blessed be the hour you were saved from the salt sea and that fearful man," said a maiden, whose blushing cheek and brightening eye indicated more than common sympathy. "And oh, Stephen Porter, my son," resumed the father, "never set foot on shipboard with that mariner more." In another group stood a young seaman with his sister's arms linked around his neck, receiving the blessings and the admonitions which female lips shower so vainly upon the sterner sex. "This is the third time, Giles, thou hast sailed with Richard Faulder, and every time my alarm and thy perils increase. Many a fair face has he witnessed the fate of, and many a fair ship has he survived the wreck of. Think of the sea, since think of it thou must, but never more think of it with such a companion." In another group, a young woman stood gazing on a sailor's face, and in her looks fear and love held equal mastery. "Oh, William Rowanberry," said she, and her hand trembled with affection in his while she spoke. "I would have held my heart widowed for 1 year and a day in memory of thee. And though there be fair lads in Ullswater, and fairer still in Allanbay, I'll no say they would have prevailed against my regard for thee before the summer. But I'll warn thee," she whispered, waving her hand seaward to give importance to her words, "never be found on the great deep with that man again." Meanwhile, the subject of this singular conversation kept pacing from stem to stern of the mermaid, gazing now and then wistfully shoreward, though he saw not a soul with whom he might share his affections. His grey hair and his melancholy look won their way to my youthful regard, while his hale and stalwart frame could not fail of making an impression on one not wholly insensible to the merits of the exterior person. A powerful mind should, in poetical justice, have a noble place of abode. I detached myself a little from the mass of people that filled the shore, and, seeming to busy myself with some driftwood which the storm had brought to the hollow of a small rock, I had an opportunity of hearing the old mariner chant, as he paced to and fro, the fragment of an old maritime ballad, part of which is still current among the seamen of Solway, along with many other singular rhymes full of maritime superstition and adventure. Sir Richard shot swift from the shore and sailed till he reached Barnhuri's steep. And a voice came to him from the green land, and one from the barren deep. The green sea shuddered, and he did shake, for the words were those which no mortals make. Away he sailed, and the lightning came, and streamed from the top of his mast. Away he sailed, and the thunder came, and spoke from the depth of the blast. "O God," he said, and his tresses so hoar shone bright in the flame as he shot from the shore. Away he sailed, and the green eye smiled, and the sea-birds sang around. He sought to land, and down sank the shores with a loud and a murmuring sound. And where the green wood and the sweet sod should be, there tumbled a wild and a shoreless sea. Away he sailed, and the moon looked out, with one large star by her side. Down shot the star, and up sprang the sea-fowl with a shriek, and roared the tide. The bark, with a leap, seemed the stars to sweep, and then to dive in the hollowest deep. Crefell's green mountain towered on his right, upon his left St. Bees, behind Carlaverock's charmed ground, before the wild wide seas, and there a witch-fire, broad and bright, shed far a wild unworldly light. A lady sat high on St. Bees' head, with her pale cheek in her hand. She gazed forth on the troubled sea and on the troubled land. She lifted her hands to heaven, her eyes rained down bright tears. Still the shallop flies. The shallop shoulders the surge and flies, but at that lady's prayer the charmed wind fell mute, nor stirred the rings of her golden hair. And over the sea there passed a breath from heaven. The sea lay mute as death, and the shallop sunders the gentle flood, no breathing wind is near. And the shallop sunders the gentle flood, and the flood lies still with fear. And the ocean, the earth, and the heavens smile sweet, as Sir Richard kneels low at that lady's feet. While the old mariner chanted this maritime rhyme, he looked upon me from time to time, and, perhaps, felt pleased in exciting the interest of a youthful mind, and obtaining a regard which had been but sparingly bestowed in his native land. He loosed a little skiff, and, stepping into it, pushed through the surge to the place where I stood, and was in a moment beside me. I could not help gazing, with an eye reflecting wonder and respect, on a face, bold, mournful, and martial as his was, which had braved so long the battle and the breeze. He threw across my shoulders a mantle of leopard skin, and said, as he walked toward his little cottage on the rock, "Youth, I promised that mantle to the first one who welcomed me from a voyage of great peril. Take it, and be happier than the giver. And glad am I to be welcomed by the son of my old Captain Randall Forster." Such were the circumstances under which I became acquainted with Sir Richard Faulder of Allan Bay. At his lonely hearth I was afterward a frequent and welcome guest, and an attentive and wondering auditor to his wild maritime legends gathered on many an isle and mainland coast. But none of all his stories made a deeper impression on my memory than the tale of the last Lord of Helvellyn. An ancient curse still clings to their name. It was, I think, in the year 1733 that, one fine summer evening, I sat on the summit of Rose Foster Cliff, gazing on the multitudes of waves which, swelled by the breeze and whitened by the moonlight, undulated as far as the eye could reach. The many lights gleaming from Allan Bay were extinguished one by one. The twinklings of remote St. Bees glimmered fainter and fainter on the Solway, while the villages and mansions on the Scottish coast, from Anand to Kirkcudbright, were perfectly silent and dark, as beseemed their devout and frugal inhabitants. As I sat and thought on the perils I had encountered and braved on the great deep, I observed a low, dark mist arise from the middle of the Solway, which, swelling out, suddenly came rolling, huge and sable, toward the Cumberland shore. Nor was fear or fancy long in supplying this exhalation with sails and pennons and the busy hum and murmur of mariners. As it approached the cliff on which I had seated myself, it was not without dismay that I observed it become more dark and assume more distinctly the shape of a barge with a shroud for a sail. It left the sea and settled on the beach within sea mark, maintaining still its form and still sending forth the merry din of mariners. In a moment the voices were changed from mirth to sorrow, and I heard a sound and outcry like the shriek of a ship's company whom the sea is swallowing. The cloud dissolved away, and in its place I beheld, as it were, the forms of 7 men, shaped from the cloud and stretched black on the beach, even as corses are prepared for the coffin. I was then young, and not conversant with the ways in which he above reveals and shadows out approaching sorrow to man. I went down to the beach, and, though the moon, nigh the full and in mid-heaven, threw down an unbroken light, rendering visible mountain and headland and sea, so that I might count the pebbles and shells on the shore, the 7 black shadows of men had not departed, and there appeared a space in the middle, like room measured out for an eighth. A strange terror came upon me, and I began to dread that this vision was sent for my warning, for, be assured, heaven hath many and singular revelations for the welfare and instruction of man. I prayed, and, while I prayed, the 7 shadows began to move, filling up the space prepared for another, and then they waxed dimmer, and then wholly vanished. I was much moved, and, deeming it the revelation of approaching sorrow, in which I was to be a sharer, it was past midnight before I could fall asleep. The sun had been some time risen when I was awakened by Simon Forrester, who, coming to my bedside, said, "Richard Faulder, arise, for young Lord William of Helvellyn Hall has launched his new barge on the Solway, and 7 of the best and boldest mariners of Allan Bay must bear him company to bring his fair bride from Preston Hall, even at the foot of the mountain Criffel. Hasten and come, for he sails not, be sure, without Richard Faulder." Scotland is rife with the labours of wizard and witch. The beautiful green mountain of Criffel and its lesser and immediate companions were created by a singular disaster which befell Dame Ailey Gunson. This noted and malignant witch had sustained an insult from the Sea of Solway as she crossed it in her wizard shallop, formed from a cast-off slipper. She, therefore, gathered a huge creel full of earth and rock, and, stride after stride, was advancing to close up for ever the entrance of that beautiful bay. An old and devout mariner, who witnessed her approach, thrice blessed himself, and at each time a small mountain fell out of the witch's creel. The last was the largest, and formed the mountain Criffel, which certain rustic antiquarians say is softened from creel fell, for the witch dropped earth and creel in despair. It was a gallant sight to see a shallop, with her hawsers and sails of silk, covered with streamers and damasked with gold, pushing gaily from the bay. It was gallant, too, to behold the lordly bridegroom as he stood on the prow, looking toward his true love's land, not heeding the shout and the song and the music swell with which his departure was hailed. It was gallant to see the maids and the matrons of Cumberland standing in crowds on headland and cliff, waving their white hands seaward, as we spread our sails to the wind and shot away into the Solway, with our streamers dancing and fluttering like the mane of a steed as he gallops against the wind. Proud of our charge and glorying in our skill, we made the good ship go through the surge as we willed, and every turn we made, and every time we wetted her silken sails, there came a shout and a trumpet sound from the shore, applauding the 7 merry mariners of Allan Bay. Helvellyn Hall, of which there is now no stone standing, save an old sundial around which herdsmen gather at noonday to hear of old marvels of the foresters, was an extensive mansion built in the times when perils from the pirate and the Scot were dreaded, and stood on a swelling knoll encompassed with wood, visible from afar to mariners. In the centre was a tower, and on the summit of the tower was a seat, and in that seat tradition will yet tell you that the good Lord Walter Forester sat for a certain time in every day of the year, looking on the sea. The swallows and other birds which made their nests and their roosts on the castle top became so accustomed to his presence that they built and sang and brought forth their young beside him, and old men, as they beheld him, shook their heads and muttered over the ancient prophecy which a saint, who suffered from prosecution, had uttered against the house of Helvellyn. Let the Lord of Helvellyn look long on the sea, for a sound shall he hear, and a sight shall he see. The sight he shall see is a bonny ship sailing, the sound he shall hear is of weeping and wailing. A sight shall he see on the green Solway shore, and no lord of Helvellyn shall ever see more. As we scudded swiftly through the water, I looked toward the shore of Cumberland, stretching far and near, with all its winding outline, interrupted with woody promontories, and there I beheld the old Lord Walter of Helvellyn, seated on the topmost tower of his castle, looking toward the Scottish shore. I thought on the dying man's rhyme, and thought on the vision of last night, and I counted the mariners, and looked again on the castle and Lord Walter. And I saw that the fulfilling of the prophecy and the vision was approaching. Though deeply affected, I managed the barge with my customary skill, and she flew across the bay, leaving a long furrow of foam behind. Michael Halmer, an old mariner of Allan Bay, afterwards told me that he never beheld a fairer sight than the barge that day, breasting the billows, and he stood warding off the sun with his hands from his fading eyes till we reached the middle of the bay. At that time, he said, he beheld something like a ship formed of a black cloud sailing beside us, which moved as we moved and tacked as we tacked, had the semblance of the same number of mariners, and in every way appeared like the bridegroom's barge. He trembled with dismay, for he knew the spectre shallop of Solway, which always sails by the side of the ship which the sea is about to swallow. It was not my fortune to behold fully this fearful vision, but, while I gazed toward Helvellyn Hall, I felt a dread, and although I saw nothing on which my fears could fix, I remember that a kind of haze or exhalation, resembling the thin shooting of a distant light, floated through the air at our side, which I could not long endure to look upon. The old lord still preserved his position in the tower, and sat gazing toward us, as still and as motionless as a marble statue, and with an intensity of gaze like one who is watching the coming of destiny. The acclamations which greeted our departure from Cumberland were exceeded by those which welcomed us to the Scottish shore. The romantic and mountainous coast of Colvend and Siddick was crowded with shepherd and matron and maid, who stood as motionless as their native rocks, and as silent, too, till we approached within reach of their voices, and then such a shout arose as startled the gulls and cormorants from rock and cavern for a full mile. The Scotch are a demure, a careful, and a singular people, and amid much homeliness of manner have something of a poetical way of displaying their affections, which they treasure too for great occasions, or, as they say, daemon times. There are certain of their rustics much given to the composition of song and of ballad, in which a natural elegance occasionally glimmers among the antique and liquid dialect. I have been told the lowland language of Scotland is more soft and persuasive even than that of England, and assuredly there was Martin Robson, a mariner of mine, in the Mermaid, whose wily Scotch tongue made the hearts of half the damsels at Cumberland dance to their lips. But many of their ballads are of a barbarous jingle and can only be admired because the names of those whom their authors love and hate, and the names of the hill and dale and coast and stream are interwoven with a ready ease unknown among the rustic rhymes of any other people. Preston Hall, the plough has long since passed over its foundation stones, was long the residence of a branch of the powerful and ancient name of Maxwell, and such was its fame for generosity that the beggar or pilgrim who went in at the eastern gate empty always came out at the western gate full and blessing the bounty of the proprietor. It stood at the bottom of a deep and beautiful bay, at the entrance of which two knolls, slow in their swell from the land and abrupt in their rise from the sea, seemed almost to shut out all approach. In former times they had been crowned with slight towers of defence. It was a fairy nook for beauty, and tradition, which loves to embellish the scenes on which nature has been lavish of her bounty, asserted that the twin hillocks of Preston Bay were formerly one green hill, till a wizard, whose name has not yet ceased to work marvels, cleft the knoll asunder with his wand and poured the sea into the aperture, laying, at the same time, the foundation stone of Preston Hall with his own hand. On the sides and summits of these small hills stood two crowds of peasants who welcomed the coming of Lord William with the sounding of instruments of no remarkable harmony. As this clamorous hail ceased, the melody of maidens' tongues made ample amends for the instrumental discord. They greeted us as we passed with this poetical welcome after the manner of their country. Ye maidens of Allan Bay, sore may ye mourn, for your lover is gone and will wedded return. His white sail is filled, and the barge cannot stay. Wide flashes the water, she shoots through the bay. Weep, maidens of Cumberland, shower your tears salter. The priest is prepared, and the bride's at the altar. The bride she is gone to the altar and far, and in wrath flies gay Gordon of Green Lochinvar. Young Maxwell of Munches, thy gold spur is dyed. In thy steed and thy heart leaps in anguish and pride. The bold men of Annan and proud Nidisdale have lost her they loved, and may join in the wail. Lord William is come, and the bird in the pine, the leaf on the tree, and the ship in the brine, the blue heaven above and below the green earth, seem proud of his presence, and burst into mirth. Then come, thou proud fair one, in meek modest mood. The bridal bed's ready, unloosen thy snood. The bridal bed's ready, but hearken, high lord. Though strong be thy right arm, and sharp be thy sword, mock not Beatrice Maxwell, else there shall be sorrow, through Helvellyn's valleys, ere sunrise tomorrow. Away, haste away, can a gallant groom falter, when the bridal wine's poured, and the bride's at the altar. During this minstrel salutation, the barge floated into the bosom of Preston Bay, and, through all its woody links and greenwood nooks, the song sounded mellow and more mellow as it was flung from point to point over the sunny water. The barge soon approached the green sward, which, sloping downwards from the hull, bordering with its livelier hue the dull deep green of the ocean, presented a ready landing place. When we were within a lance's length of the shore, there appeared, coming toward us from a deep grove of holly, a female figure, attired in the manner of the farmer matrons of Scotland, with a small plaid or mantle fastened over her grey lint and woolen gown, and a white cap or mutch surmounting, rather than covering, a profusion of lyart locks which came over her brow and neck like remains of the winter snow. She aided her steps with a staff, and, descending to the prow of the barge till the sea touched her feet, stretched her staff seaward and said, with a deep voice and an unembarrassed tone, "What wouldest thou, William Forester, the doomed son of a doomed house, with Beatrice Maxwell, the blessed child of a house whose name shall live and whose children shall breathe while green woods grow and clear streams run? Return as thou camest, nor touch a shore hostile to thee and thine. If thy foot displaces but one blade of grass, thy life will be as brief as the endurance of thy name, which that giddy boy is even now writing on the sand within sea mark. The next tide will pass over thee and blot it out for ever and for ever. Thy father, even now watching thy course from his castle top, shall soon cease to be the warder of his house's destiny, and the Cumberland boor, as he gazes into the bosom of the Solway, shall sigh for the ancient and valiant name of Forster. While this singular speech was uttering, I gazed on the person of the speaker, from whom no one who once looked could well withdraw his eyes. She seemed some 70 years old, but unbowed or unbroken by age, and had that kind of commanding look which common spirits dread. Lord William listened to her words with a look of kindness and respect. "Marjorie Forsyth," he said, "thou couldst have prophesied more fortunately and wisely hadst thou wished it, but thou art a faithful friend and servant to my Beatrice. Accept this broad piece of gold, and imagine a more pleasant tale when, with the evening tide, I return with my love to Helvellyn." The gold fell at the old woman's feet, but it lay glittering and untouched among the grass, for her mind and eye seemed intent on matters connected with the glory of her master's house. "Friend am I to Beatrice Maxwell, but no servant," said Marjorie, in a haughty tone, "though it's sweet to serve a face so beautiful. Touch not this shore, I say again, William Forster. But it's vain to forbid. The thing that must be must. We are foreordained to run our course, and this is the last course of the gallant house of Forster." She then stepped aside, opposing Lord William no longer, who, impatient at her opposition, was preparing to leap ashore. Dipping her staff in the water as a fisher dips its rod, she held it dripping toward the Solway, to which she now addressed herself. "False and fathomless sea, slumbering now in the sweet summer sun like a new lulled babe, I have lived by thy side for years of sin that I shall not sum, and every year hast thou craved and yearned for thy morsel, and made the maids and matrons wail in Green Galloway and Nithsdale. When wilt thou be satisfied, thou hungry sea? Even now, sunny and sweet as thou seemest, dost thou crave for the mouthful ordained to thee by ancient prophecy, and the fair and dainty morsel is at hand." Her eyes, dim and spiritless at first, became filled, while she uttered this apostrophe to the sea, with a wild and agitated light. Her stature seemed to augment, and her face to dilate with more grief than joy, and her locks, snowy and sapless with age, writhed on her forehead and temples as if possessed with a distinct life of their own. Throwing her staff into the sea, she then went into the grove of holly and disappeared. "May I be buried beyond the plummet sound," said Sam Dacre of Skidawbeck, "if I fail to prove of that dame's kirtle with flattened swan-shot. I never listened to such unblessed language." And he presented his carbine after her, while William McGowan, a Galloway sailor, laid his hand on the muzzle and said, "I'll tell thee what. Marjorie Forsyth has more forecast in the concerns of the great deep than a wise mariner ought to despise. Swan-shot, man. She would shake it off her charmed calamanco kirtle as a swan shakes snow from its wings. I see you're scantily acquaint with the uncanny pranks of our Colvind dame, but gang up to the Barren Point and down to Barrenhoorie Bank, and if the crews of 2 bonny ships buried under 15 fathom of quicksand and running water won't awaken in telling you whose uncanny skill sunk them there, the simplest hind will whisper you that Marjorie Forsyth kens mair about it than a God-fearing woman should. So you see, Lord William Forster, I would even counsel you to make your presence scarce on this Kittle coast. Just wise yourself warily o'er the salt water again. And true love's no like a new-killed kid in summer. It will keep, you see, it will keep. This cross-comer will grow kindly, and we shall come snoring back in our barge some bonny moonlit summer night, and carry away my young lady with a sweeping oar and a wetted sail. For if we persist when she resists, we shall have wet sarks and drocked hair. Say ye laugh and listen not. A well, them that will to Cooper will to Cooper. A doomed man's easily drowned.
The thing that mun be, and sic things shall be if we sell ale."
These predestinating exclamations were abridged by a long train of bridal guests hurrying from the hall to receive the bridegroom, who, disregarding all admonition, leapt gaily ashore and was welcomed with trumpet flourish and the continued sound of the lowland pipe. He was followed by 6 of his 7 mariners. I alone remained, overawed by the vision I had beheld on the preceding night, by the prophetic words of the sorceress of Siddic, and by that boding forecast of disaster which the wise would do well to regard. On all sides people were seated on the rising grounds. The tree-tops, the immemorial resting places of ravens and rooks, were filled with young men, anxious to see the procession to the chapel of Preston and to hearken the bridal joy, and even the rough and dizzy cliff of Barnhurry Burn, which overlooks the Solway for many miles, had the possession of its summit disputed with its native cormorants and eagles by some venturous schoolboys, who thus showed that love of adventure which belongs to the children of the sea-coast. The sun was in noon when we landed in Preston Bay, and its edge was touching the grassy tops of the western hills of Galloway, when, shout above shout, from wood and eminence, the waving of white hands from field and knoll, and the sudden awakening of all manner of clamorous and mirthful melody announced the coming of the bridal crowd. The gates of Preston Hall burst suddenly open. Out upon the level lawn gushed an inundation of youths and maidens clad in their richest dresses, and the living stream flowed down to the Solway side. As they approached, a shallop, covered from the masthead to the water with streamers and pennons and garlands, came suddenly from a small anchorage scooped out of the bosom of the garden, making the coming tide gleam to a distance with the gold and silver lavished in its decoration. But my admiration of this beautiful shallop was soon interrupted by the appearance of a lady who, standing on the ground by the prow of the bride's barge, looked earnestly seaward and trembled so much that the white satin dress which covered her from bosom to heel, studded and sewn and flowered with the most costly stones and metals, shook as if touched by an ungentle wind. Her long tresses of raven-black hair, and which, in the boast of maidenhood of my early days, descended till she could sit upon them, partook of her agitation. Her eyes alone, large and bright, and fringed with long lashes of a black still deeper than that of her hair, were calm and contemplative, and seemed with her mind meditating on some perilous thing. While she stood thus, a maiden came to her side, and, casting a long white veil, a present from the bridegroom, over her head, shrouded her to the feet. But the elegance of her form and the deep dark glance of her expressive eyes triumphed over the costly gift, though the fringe was of diamonds, and the disastrous tale of the youth who perished swimming over the Solway to his love was wrought, or rather damasked, in the middle. I could have gazed from that hour till this on this beautiful vision, but while I looked, there came slowly from the wood a figure of a woman, bent with age or distress to the ground, and entirely covered in a black mantle. She approached the bride unperceived, and lay down at her feet, as a footstool on which she must tread before she could enter the shallop. This was unheeded of many, or of all, for the blessings showered by all ranks on the departing pair, the bustle of the mariners preparing to sail with the tide, which now filled Preston Bay, the sounding of bugle and pipe, and the unremitting rivalry in song and ballad between the mariners and the barges of the bridegroom and bride, successfully filled every mind save mine, overclouded then, and as it has ever since been, before some coming calamity. Ballad and song passed over my memory without leaving a verse behind. One song alone, sung by a mariner of Allan Bay, and which has long been popular on the coast, interested me much. More, I confess, from the dark and mysterious manner in which it figured or shadowed forth our catastrophe than from its poetical merit, the last verse alone approaching the true tone of the lyric. Upon the bonny mountainside, upon the leafy trees, upon the rich and golden fields, upon the deep green seas, the wind comes breathing freshly forth. Ho, pluck up from the sand our anchor, and go shooting as a winged shaft from the land.
The sheep love Skiddaw's lonesome top, the shepherd loves his hill. The throstle loves the budding bush, sweet woman loves her will. The lark loves heaven for visiting, but green earth for her home. And I love the good ships singing through the billows in their foam. My son, a grey-haired peasant, said, leap on the grassy land, and deeper than 5 fathoms sink thine anchor in the sand, and meek and humble make thy heart, for ere yon brightening moon lifts her wondrous lamp above the wave, a midnight's lowly noon, there shall be shriekings heard at sea, lamentings heard at shore. My son, go pluck thy mainsail down, and tempt the heaven no more. Come forth and weep, come forth and pray, grey dame and hoary swain, all ye who have got sons tonight upon the faithless main. And wherefore, old man, should I turn? Dost hear the merry pipe, the harvest bugle winding among Scotland cornfields ripe, and see her dark-eyed maidens dance, whose willing arms alway are open for the merry lads of bonny Allan Bay? Full sore the old man sighed and said, go bid the mountain wind breathe softer, and the deep waves hear the prayers of frail mankind, and mar the whirlwind in his might. His hoary head he shook, gazed on the youth and on the sea, and sadder waxed his look. Lo, look, here comes our lovely bride, breathes there a wind so rude as chafes the billows when she goes in beauty o'er the flood. The raven fleece that dances on her round and swan-white neck, the white foot that wakes music on the smooth and shaven deck, the white hand that goes waving thus as if it told the brine, be gentle in your ministry, o'er you I rule and reign. The eye that looks so lovely, yet so lofty in its sway. Old man, the sea adores them, so adieu, sweet Allan Bay. During the continuance of this song, an old gentleman of the house of Maxwell, advancing through the press to the barges, said aloud, A challenge, ye gallants, a challenge. Let the bridegroom take his merry mariners of England, let the bride take her mariners of old Galloway. Push the barges from Preston Bay as the signal pipe sounds, and a pipe of blood-red wine to a cupful of cold water, that we reach Allan Bay first. As the old man finished his challenge, hundreds of hats and bonnets too were thrown in the air, and the bridegroom, with a smile, took his offered hand and said, What, Sir Marmaduke Maxwell, wilt thou brave us too? A pipe of the richest wine to a drink of the saltest brine in the centre of the Solway, that the merry lads of Allan Bay exceed thee at least by 10 strokes of the oar. The English mariners replied, as is their wont, with a shout, threw aside their jackets and caps, and prepared gladly for the coming contest. Nor were the mariners of Siddick and Colvend slow in preparing. They made themselves ready with that silent and sedate alacrity peculiar to that singular people. May I never see Skiddaw again, said William Selby of Derwent, nor taste Nancy Grogson's grog, or her pretty daughter's lips, if the freshwater lads of Bonhoorie surpass the saltwater lads of Allan Bay. And for my part, said Charles Carson, in answer to my comrade's vow, may I be turned into a sheldrake and doomed to swim to doomsday in the long black lake of Lochmaben if the pokepuds of Skiddaw surpass the canny lads of Green Galloway. And both parties, matched in numbers, in strength, of equal years and of similar ability, stood with looks askance on each other, ready to start, and willing to win the bridal boast and the bride or bridegroom's favour. And now, my sweet bride, said Lord William, shall I help thee into thy barge? Loth I am that thy kinsman's vaunt causes a brief separation. Now, guide thy barge wisely and warily, said he to her helmsman. I would rather pay the wine for my mistress 10,000-fold than one lock of her raven hair should be put in jeopardy. If thou bringest her harmless into Allan Bay, I will give 100 pieces of gold to thee and thy mates. Shouldst thou peril her in thy folly, come before my face no more. Peril Beatrice Maxwell, Lord William? Said the Scottish helmsman with a look of proud scorn. My fathers fought to the saddle-laps in English blood for the men of the house of Maxwell, and I would rather see all who own the surname of Forster sinking in the Solway without one to help them than be the cause of the fair maiden of Preston soiling slipper or snood. I see you dinna ken the Howardsons of Glenhowen." "I know naught of the Howardsons of Glenhowen," said the bridegroom, "but what I am proud and pleased with. Therefore ply the oar and manage the sail, for I have men with me who will put you to your might in both." To this conciliating speech the maritime representative of the ancient Howardsons of Glenhowen returned no answer, but, busying himself in his vocation, chanted, as was his wont on going on any important mission, some fragments of an old ballad made by one of the minstrels of the House of Maxwell when its glory was at its fullest. "Give the sail to the south wind, thou mariner bold, keep the vessel all stately and steady, and sever the green grassy sward with your prow, where yon lances gleam level and ready. An ominous star sits above the bright moon, and the vessel goes faster and faster. And see the changed planet, so lovely even now, glows like blood and betokens disaster. The moon, thou coward churl, lo, see the swift shafts, all as fleet as the winter snow flying. And hearken the war steed, he neighs in his strength and tramples the dead and the dying. And the bark smote the ground, and ashore they all leapt, with war shout and pipe note and clangor of two-handed claymore and hauberk, and soon their foes they consumed in their anger. All on yon fair shore where the cowslips bloom thick, and on the sea waves so brightly are leaping, the sun saw in gladness, the moon saw in death, 300 proud foresters sleeping. And long shall the Cumberland damsels weep where the sweet Ellen water is flowing, the hour the gay lads of Helvellyn were slain by Lord Maxwell and gallant Glenhowen. Ere the song had ceased, the bride proceeded to enter the barge, where she perceived at her feet a figure in a black mantle, and scarce refrained from shrieking. "Marjorie! What wouldest thou with me, Marjorie?" she said. "The cottage thou livest in I have given thee." "Words, wealth, and creature comforts are no cares of mine," said the old domestic of the House of Maxwell. "I laid me down here that ere Beatrice Maxwell departs with one of a doomed house, she should step over my grey hairs. Have I not said? Have I not prayed?" "Marjorie, Marjorie," said the bride, "be silent and be wise." "Are we to stand here and listen to the idle words of a crazed menial?" said one of the House of Maxwell. "Aboard, ye gallants, aboard!" And placing the bride on deck, the barges, urged by oar and sail, darted out of the Bay of Preston, while the shout and song of clamouring multitudes followed us far into the ocean. The wind of the summer twilight, gentle and dewy, went curling the surface of the water. Before us the green mountains of Cumberland rose. Behind us we beheld the huge outline of the Scottish hills, while, a full stone cast asunder, the barges pursued their way, and the crews, silent and anxious, had each their hopes of conquering in the contest. As we went scudding away, I looked toward the hall of Helvellyn, and there I beheld on its summit the old lord with his grey hair, his hands clasped, and his eyes turned intent on the barge which contained his son. I thought on the prophecy and on the vision of the preceding evening, and looked toward the hills of Scotland, now fast diminishing in the distance. At first I thought I saw the waters agitated in the track we had pursued, and, continuing to gaze, I observed the sea furrowed into a tremendous hollow, following the sinuous course of the barge. I now knew this to be a whirlwind, and, dreading that it would fasten on our sails, I tacked northward. The whirlwind followed also. I tacked southward, and to the south veered the whirlwind, increasing in violence as it came. The last sight I beheld was the sea at our stern, whirling round in fearful undulations. The wind at once seized our sails, turned us thrice about, and down went the barge head foremost in the centre of Solway. I was stunned, and felt the cold brine bubbling in my ears as, emerging from the flood, I tried to swim. Barge, bridegroom, and mariners were all gone. The bride's barge came in a moment to my side and saved me, and standing for the coast of Cumberland, spread the tale of sorrow along the shore where crowds had assembled to welcome us. The old lord of Helvellyn remained in the castle top after he had witnessed the loss of his son, and when his favourite servant ventured to approach, he was found seated in his chair, his hands clasped more in resignation than agony, his face turned to the Solway, and his eyes gazing with the deepest intensity, and stiff and dead. The morning tide threw the body of Lord William and those of his 6 mariners ashore, and when I walked down at day dawn to the beach, I found them stretched in a row on the very spot where the vision had revealed their fate to me so darkly and so surely. Such a tale as this will be often told you among the seacoast cottages of Cumberland. Young man, be wise, and weigh well the mysterious ways of Providence. Though my mind's not hoodwinked with rustic marvels, I do think there are more things in the grove, the air, the flood, yea, and the charnelled earth than what wise man, who walks so proud as if his form alone filled the wide temple of the universe, will let a frail mind say. I'd write in the creed of the sagest head alive that fearful forms, holy or reprobate, do page men's heels, that shapes, too horrid for our gaze, stand over the murderer's dust, and for revenge glare up, even till the stars weep for very pity. Along the Sea of Solway, romantic on the Scottish side, with its woodland, its bays, its cliffs and headlands, and interesting on the English side, with its many beautiful towns with their shadows on the water, rich pastures, safe harbours, and numerous ships, there still linger many traditional stories of a maritime nature, most of them connected with superstitions singularly wild and unusual. To the curious, these tales afford a rich fund of entertainment from the many diversities of the same story, some dry and barren and stripped of all the embellishments of poetry, others dressed out in all the riches of a superstitious belief and haunted imagination. In this they resemble the inland traditions of the peasants, but many of the oral treasures of the Galwegian or the Cumbrian coast have the stamp of the Dane and the Norseman upon them, and claim but a remote or faint affinity with the legitimate legends of Caledonia. Something like a rude, prosaic outline of several of the most noted of the northern ballads, the adventures and depredations of the old ocean kings, still lends life to the evening tale, and, among others, the story of the haunted ships is still popular among the maritime peasantry. One fine harvest evening, I went on board the shallop of Richard Faulder of Allan Bay, and, committing ourselves to the waters, we allowed a gentle wind from the east to waft us at its pleasure toward the Scottish coast. We passed the sharp promontory of Siddick, and, skirting the land within a stone cast, glided along the shore till we came within sight of the ruined abbey of Sweetheart. The green mountain of Crefel ascended beside us, and the bleat of the flocks from its summit, together with the winding of the evening horn of the reapers, came softened into something like music over land and sea. We pushed our shallop into a deep and wooded bay, and sat silently looking on the serene beauty of the place. The moon glimmered in her rising through the tall shafts of the pines of Carlaverock, and the sky, with scarce a cloud, showered down on wood and headland and bay the twinkling beams of 1,000 stars, rendering every object visible. The tide, too, was coming with that swift and silent swell observable when the wind is gentle. The woody curves along the land were filling with the flood till it touched the green branches of the drooping trees, while in the center current the roll and the plunge of 1,000 pellets told to the experienced fishermen that salmon were abundant. As we looked, we saw an old man emerging from a path that winded to the shore through a grove of doddered hazel.
He carried a have-net on his back, while behind him came a girl bearing a small harpoon with which the fishers are remarkably dexterous in striking their prey. The senior seated himself on a large grey stone which overlooked the bay, laid aside his bonnet, and submitted his bosom and neck to the refreshing sea breeze, and taking his harpoon from his attendant, sat with the gravity and composure of a spirit of the flood, with his ministering nymph behind him. We pushed our shallop to the shore, and soon stood at their side. "This is old Mark MacMorrin, the mariner, with his granddaughter Barbara," said Richard Faulder, in a whisper that had something of fear in it. "He knows every creek and cavern and quicksand in Solway, has seen the spectre hound that haunts the Isle of Man, has heard him bark, and at every bark has seen a ship sink. And he has seen, too, the haunted ships in full sail, and, if all tales be true, he has sailed in them himself. He's an awful parson." Though I perceived in the communication of my friend something of the superstition of the sailor, I could not help thinking that common rumour had made a happy choice in singling out old Mark to maintain her intercourse with the invisible world. His hair, which seems to have refused all intercourse with the comb, hung matted upon his shoulders. A kind of mantle, or rather blanket, pinned with a wooden skewer round his neck, fell mid-leg down, concealing all his nether garments as far as a pair of hose, darned with yarn of all conceivable colours, and a pair of shoes, patched and repaired till nothing of the original structure remained, and clasped on his feet with two massy silver buckles. If the dress of the old man was rude and sordid, that of his granddaughter was gay and even rich. She wore a bodice of fine wool, wrought round the bosom with alternate leaf and lily, and a kirtle of the same fabric, which, almost touching her white and delicate ankle, showed her snowy feet, so fairy light and round that they scarcely seemed to touch the grass where she stood. Her hair, a natural ornament which woman seeks much to improve, was of bright glossy brown, and encumbered rather than adorned with a snood set thick with maritime productions, among which the small clear pearl found in the Solway was conspicuous. Nature had not trusted to a handsome shape and a sylph-like air for young Barbara's influence over the heart of man, but had bestowed a pair of large, bright blue eyes, swimming in liquid light, so full of love and gentleness and joy that all the sailors from Annenwater to far St. Bees acknowledged their power and sung songs about the bonny lass of Mark MacMorrin. She stood holding a small gaff-hook of polished steel in her hand, and seemed not dissatisfied with the glances I bestowed on her from time to time, and which I held more than requited by a single glance of those eyes which retained so many capricious hearts in subjection. The tide, though rapidly augmenting, had not yet filled the bay at our feet. The moon now streamed fairly over the tops of Carlaverock pines, and showed the expanse of ocean dimpling and swelling, on which sloops and shallops came dancing, and displaying at every turn their extent of white sail against the beam of the moon. I looked on old Mark the mariner, who, seated motionless on his grey stone, kept his eye fixed on the increasing waters with a look of seriousness and sorrow, in which I saw little of the calculating spirit of a mere fisherman. Though he looked on the coming tide, his eyes seemed to dwell particularly on the black and decayed hulls of two vessels which, half immersed in the quicksand, still addressed to every heart a tale of shipwreck and desolation. The tide wheeled and foamed around them, and, creeping inch by inch up the side, at last fairly threw its waters over the top, and a long and hollow eddy showed the resistance with which the liquid element received. The moment they were fairly buried in the water, the old man clasped his hands together and said, "Blessed be the tide that will break over and bury you forever. Sad to mariners and sorrowful to maids and mothers has the time been you have choked up this deep and bonny bay. For evil were ye sent, and for evil have ye continued. Every season finds from you its song of sorrow and wail, its funeral processions, and its shrouded corses. Woe to the land where the wood grew that made ya. Cursed be the axe that hewed ye on the mountains, the hands that joined ye together, the bay that ye first swam in, and the wind that wafted ye here. 7 times have ye put my life in peril. 3 fair sons have ye swept from my side, and 2 bonny grandbairns, and now, even now, your waters foam and flash for my destruction, did I venture my infirm limbs in quest of food in your deadly bay. I see by that ripple and that foam, and hear by the sound and singing of your surge, that ye yearn for another victim, but it shall not be me or mine.
Even as the old mariner addressed himself to the wrecked ships, a young man appeared at the southern extremity of the bay, holding his halve-net in his hand and hastening into the current. Mark rose and shouted and waved him back from a place which, to a person unacquainted with the dangers of the bay, real and superstitious, seemed sufficiently perilous. His granddaughter, too, added her voice to his and waved her white hands, but the more they strove, the faster advanced the peasant, till he stood to his middle in the water, while the tide increased every moment in depth and strength. "Andrew! Andrew!" cried the young woman, in a voice quavering with emotion. "Turn, turn, I tell you! Oh, the ships, the haunted ships!" But the appearance of a fine run of fish had more influence with the peasant than the voice of bonny Barbara, and forward he dashed, net in hand. In a moment he was borne off his feet and mingled like foam with the water, and hurried toward the fatal eddies which whirled and roared round the sunken ships. But he was a powerful young man and an expert swimmer. He seized on one of the projecting ribs of the nearest hulk, and clinging to it with the grasp of despair, uttered yell after yell, sustaining himself against the prodigious rush of the current. From a shieling of turf and straw, within the pitch of a bar from the spot where we stood, came out an old woman, bent with age and leaning on a crutch. "I heard the voice of that lad Andrew Lammy. Can the child be drowning that he surls so uncannily?" said the old woman, seating herself on the ground and looking earnestly at the water. "Oh, aye," she continued. "He's doomed! He's doomed! Heart and hand can never save him. Boats, ropes, and men's strength and wit, all vain. He's doomed! He's doomed!" By this time I had thrown myself into the shallop, followed reluctantly by Richard Faulder, over whose courage and kindness of heart superstition had great power. And with one push from the shore and some exertion in sculling, we came within a quoit cast of the unfortunate fisherman. He stayed not to profit by our aid, for, when he perceived us near, he uttered a piercing shriek of joy and bounded toward us through the agitated element the full length of an oar. I saw him for a second on the surface of the water, but the eddying current sucked him down, and all I ever beheld of him again was his hand held above the flood and clutching in agony at some imaginary aid. I sat gazing in horror on the vacant sea before us. But a breathing time before, a human being full of youth and strength and hope was there. His cries were still ringing in my ears and echoing in the woods, and now nothing was seen or heard save the turbulent expanse of water and the sound of its chafing on the shores. We pushed back our shallop and resumed our station on the cliff beside the old mariner and his descendant. "Wherefore sought ye to peril your own lives fruitlessly," said Mark, "in attempting to save the doomed? Whoso touches those infernal ships never survives to tell the tale. Woe to the man who is found nigh them at midnight when the tide has subsided, and they arise in their former beauty with forecastle and deck and sail and pennon and shroud. Then is seen the streaming of lights along the water from their cabin windows, and then is heard the sound of mirth and the clamour of tongues, and the infernal whoop and halloo and song ringing far and wide. Woe to the man who comes nigh them." To all this my Allan Bay companion listened with a breathless attention.
I felt something touched with a superstition to which I partly believed I had seen one victim offered up, and I inquired of the old mariner, how and when came these haunted ships there? To me they seem but the melancholy relics of some unhappy voyagers, and much more likely to warn people to shun destruction than entice and delude them to it. "And so," said the old man with a smile which had more of sorrow in it than of mirth, "and so, young man, these black and shattered hulks seem to the eye of the multitude. But things are not what they seem. That water, a kind and convenient servant to the wants of man, which seems so smooth and so dimpling and so gentle, has swallowed up a human soul even now, and the place where it covers, so fair and so level, is a faithless quicksand out of which none can escape. Things are otherwise than they seem. Had you lived as long as I have had the sorrow to live, had you seen the storms and braved the perils and endured the distresses which have befallen me, had you sat gazing on the dreary ocean at midnight on a haunted coast, had you seen comrade after comrade, brother after brother, and son after son swept away by the merciless ocean from your very side, had you seen the shapes of friends doomed to the wave and the quicksand appear unto you in the dreams and visions of the night, then would your mind have been prepared for crediting the maritime legends of mariners, and the 2 haunted Danish ships would have had their terrors for you, as they have for all who sojourn on this coast. Of the time and the cause of their destruction, continued the old man, I know nothing certain. They have stood as you have seen them for uncounted time, and while all other ships wrecked on this unhappy coast have gone to pieces and rotted and sunk away in a few years, these 2 haunted hulks have neither sunk in the quicksand, nor has a single spar or board been displaced. Maritime legend says that 2 ships of Denmark, having had permission for a time to work deeds of darkness and dolour on the deep, were at last condemned to the whirlpool and the sunken rock, and were wrecked in this bonny bay as a sign to seamen to be gentle and devout. The night when they were lost was a harvest evening of uncommon mildness and beauty. The sun had newly set. The moon came brighter and brighter out, and the reapers lay on their sickles at the root of the standing corn, stood on rock and bank, looking at the increasing magnitude of the waters, for sea and land were visible from St. Bees to Barnhoorie. The sails of 2 vessels were soon seen bent for the Scottish coast, and, with speed outrunning the swiftest ships, they approached the dangerous quicksands and headland of Barron Point. On the deck of the foremost ship not a living soul was seen or shape, unless something in darkness and form resembling a human shadow could be called a shape, which flitted from extremity to extremity of the ship, with the appearance of trimming the sails and directing the vessel's course. But the decks of its companion were crowded with human shapes. The captain and mate and sailor and cabin boy all seemed there, and from them the sound of mirth and minstrelsy echoed over land and water. The coast which they squirted along was one of extreme danger, and the reapers shouted to warn them to beware of sandbank and rock, but of this friendly counsel no notice was taken, except that a large and famished dog, which sat on the prow, answered every shout with a long, loud, and a melancholy howl. The deep sandbank of Carstethorne was expected to arrest the career of these desperate navigators, but they passed, with the celerity of waterfowl, over an obstruction which had wrecked many pretty ships. Old men shook their heads and departed, saying, "We have seen the fiend sailing in a bottomless ship. Let us go home and pray." But one young and wilful man said, "Fiend? I'll warrant it's nae fiend, but douce Janet Witherson's the witch, holding a carouse with some of her Cumberland cummers, and mickle red wine will be spilt atween them."
toad, I would gladly have a toothful. I'll warrant it's nane of your cowed sour slay water, like a bottle of Bailey's Skrinky's port, but right drop of my heart's blood stuff that would waken a body out of their last linen. I wonder where the comers will anchor their craft." "And I'll vow," said another rustic, "the wine they quaff is none of your visionary drink, such as a drouthy body has dished out to his lips in a dream. Nor is it shadowy and insubstantial like the vessels they sail in, which are made out of a cockle shell or a cast-off slipper or the paring of a seaman's right thumbnail. I once got a hansel out of a witch's quay myself, and Marian Mathers of Dustyfoot, whom they tried to bury in the old kirkyard of Dunsicourt. But the comer raised as fast as they laid her down, and nae would else she lie but the bonny green kirkyard of Keir, among the douce and sponsible folk. So I'll vow that the wine of a witch's cup is as fell liquor as ever did a kindly turn to a poor man's heart, and be they fiends or be they witches, if they have red wine as steer, I'll risk a drouked sark for a glorious toad on it." "Silence, ye sinners," said the minister's son of a neighbouring parish, who united in his own person his father's lack of devotion with his mother's love of liquor. "Whisht! Speak as if you had the fear of something holy before you. Let the vessels run their own way to destruction. Who can stay the eastern wind and the current of the Solway Sea? I can find a scripture warrant for that. So let them try their strength on Blauhooly rocks and their might on the broad quicksand. There's a surf running there would knock the ribs together of a galley built by the imps of the pit and commanded by the Prince of Darkness. Bonnily and bravely they sail away there, but before the blast blows by they'll be wrecked, and red wine and strong brandy will be rife as dyke water, and will drink the health of bonny Bell Blackness out of her left foot slipper." The speech of the young profligate was applauded by several of his companions, and away they flew to the bay of Blauhooly, from whence they never returned. The two vessels were observed all at once to stop in the bosom of the bay on the spot where their hulls now appear. The mirth and the minstrelsy waxed louder than ever, and the forms of maidens with instruments of music and wine cups in their hands thronged the decks. A boat was lowered, and the same shadowy pilot who conducted the ships made it start toward the shore with the rapidity of lightning, and its head knocked against the bank where the 4 young men stood who longed for the unblessed drink. They leapt in with a laugh, and with a laugh were they welcomed on the deck, where wine cups were given to each, and as they raised them to their lips, the vessels melted away beneath their feet, and one loud shriek, mingled with laughter still louder, was heard over land and water for many miles. Nothing more was heard or seen till the morning, when the crowd who came to the beach saw with fear and wonder the 2 haunted ships, such as they now seem, masts and tackle gone, nor mark nor sign by which their name, country, or destination could be known was left remaining. Such is the tradition of the mariners, and its truth has been attested by many families whose sons and whose fathers have been drowned in the haunted bay of Blauhooly. "And trow ya," said the old woman, who, attracted from her hut by the drowning cries of the young fisherman, had remained an auditor of the mariner's legend. "And trow ye, Mark MacMorrin, that the tale of the haunted ships is done? I can say no to that. Mickle have mine ears heard, but more mine eyes have witnessed since I came to dwell in this humble home by the side of the deep sea. I mind the night well. It was on Hallowmass Eve. The nuts were cracked, and the apples were eaten, and spell and charm were tried at my fireside, till, wearied with diving into the dark waves of futurity, the lads and lasses fairly took to the more visible blessings of kind words and tender clasps and gentle courtships. Soft words in a maiden's ear and a kindlier kiss of her lip were old-world matters to me, Mark MacMorrin, though I mean not to say that I have been free of the folly of donnerin and daffin with a youth in my day and keeping tryst with him in dark and lonely places. However, as I say, these times of enjoyment were past and gone with me.
The mare's the pity that pleasure should so fast fly away. And as I could nigh make sport, I thought I should not mar any, so out I sauntered into the fresh, cold air, and sat down behind that old oak, and looked abroad on the wide sea. I had my ain sad thoughts, you may think, at the time. It was in that very bay that my blithe goodman perished, with 7 more in his company, and on that very bank where you see the waves leaping and foaming, I saw 7 stately coursers streaked, but the dearest was the 8th. It was a woeful sight to me, a widow, with 4 bonny boys, with naught to support them but these 2 hands and God's blessing and a cow's grass. I have never liked to live out of sight of this bay since that time, and mony's the moonlit night I sat looking on these watery mountains and these waste shores. It does my heart good, whatever it may do to my head. So you see, it was Hallowmas night, and looking on sea and land sat I, and my heart wandering to other thoughts soon made me forget my youthful company at home. It might be near the how hour of the night, the tide was making, and its singing brought strange old world stories with it, and I thought on the dangers that sailors endure, and the fates they meet with, and the fearful forms they see. My own blithe goodman had seen sights that made him grave enough at times, though he aye tried to laugh them away. Oh well, atween that very rock aneath us and the coming tide, I saw, or thought I saw, for the tale is so dreamlike that the whole might pass for a vision of the night, I saw the form of a man. His plaid was grey, his face was grey, and his hair, which hung down till it nearly came to the middle of his back, was as white as the white sea foam. He began to howk and dig under the bank, and God be near me, thought I. This mun be the unblessed spirit of old Adam Gowdgowpen, the miser, who is doomed to dig for shipwrecked treasure and count how many millions are hidden forever from man's enjoyment. The form found something which in shape and hue seemed a left-foot slipper of brass. So down to the tide he marched, and placing it on the water, whirled it thrice round, and the infernal slipper dilated at every turn, till it became a bonny barge, with its sails bent, and on board leapt the form, and scudded swiftly away. He came to one of the haunted ships, and, striking it with his oar, a fair ship with mast and canvas and mariner started up. He touched the other haunted ship and produced the like transformation, and away the 3 spectre ships bounded, leaving a track of fire behind them on the billows which was long unextinguished. Now was nae that a bonny and fearful sight to see between the light of the Hallowmas moon. But the tale is far from finished, for mariners say that once a year, on a certain night, if you stand on the Boran Point, you will see the infernal shallops coming snoring through the Solway. You will hear the same laugh and song and mirth and minstrelsy which our ancestors heard, see them bound over the sandbanks and sunken rocks like seagulls, cast their anchor in Blauhuli Bay, while the shadowy figure lowers down the boat and augments their numbers with the 4 unhappy mortals to whose memory a stone stands in the kirkyard, with a sinking ship and a shoreless sea cut upon it. Then the spectre ships vanish, and the drowning shriek of mortals and the rejoicing laugh of the fiends are heard, and the old hulls are left as a memorial that the old spiritual kingdom has not departed from the earth. But I maun away and trim my little cottage fire and make it burn and blaze up bonny to warm the crickets and my cold and crazy bones that maun soon be laid aneath the green sod in the eerie kirkyard. And away the old dame tottered to her cottage, secured the door on the inside, and soon the hearth flame was seen to glimmer and gleam through the keyhole and window. "I'll tell you what," said the old mariner, in a subdued tone, and with a shrewd and suspicious glance of his eye after the old sibyl. "It's a word that may not very well be uttered, But there are many mistakes made in evening stories if old Moll Moray there, where she lives, knows not mickle more than she is willing to tell of the haunted ships and their unhallowed mariners. She lives cannily and quietly. No one knows how she is fed or supported, but her dress is aye whole, her cottage ever smokes, and her table lacks neither of wine, white and red, nor fowl and fish, and white bread and brown. It was a dear scoff to Jock Matheson when he called old Moll the uncanny Carleen of Blauhooly. His boat ran round and round in the centre of the Solway. Everybody said it was enchanted, and down it went head foremost, and had nae Jock been a swimmer equal to a sheldrake, he would have fed the fish. But I'll warrant it sobered the lad's speech, and he never reckoned himself safe till he made old Moll the present of a new kirtle and a stone of cheese.
"Oh, father," said his granddaughter Barbara, "you surely wrong poor old Mary Moray. What use could it be to an old woman like her, who has no wrongs to redress, no malice to work out against mankind, and nothing to seek of enjoyment save a canny hour in a quiet grave? What use could the fellowship of fiends and the communion of evil spirits be to her? I know Jenny Primrose puts rowan tree above the door-head when she sees old Mary coming. I know the good wife of Kittleknacket wears rowanberry leaves in the headband of her blue kirtle, and all for the sake of averting the unsonsy glance of Mary's right ear. And I know that the old laird of Burntroutwater drives the 7 cows to their pasture with the wand of witch tree to keep Mary from milking them. But what has all that to do with haunted shallops, visionary mariners, and bottomless boats? I have heard myself as pleasant a tale about the haunted ships and their unworldly crews as anyone would wish to hear in a winter evening. It was told me by young Benjy Macharg one summer night, sitting on Arbiglan bank. The lad intended a sort of love meeting, but all that he could talk about was smearing sheep and shearing sheep, and of the wife which the Norway elves of the haunted ships made for his uncle Sandy Macharg. And now I shall tell you the tale as the honest lad told it to me. Alexander Macharg, besides being the laird of 3 acres of peat moss, 2 kale gardens, and the owner of 7 good milk cows, a pair of horses, and 6 pet sheep, was the husband of one of the handsomest women in 7 parishes. Many a lad sighed the day he was brided, and a Nithsdale laird and 2 Annandale moorland farmers drank themselves to their last linen as well as their last shilling through sorrow for her loss. But married was the dame, and home she was carried, to bear rule over her home and her husband, as an honest woman should. Now, you maun ken that though the flesh and blood lovers of Alexander's bonny wife all ceased to love and sue her after she became another's, there were certain admirers who did not consider their claim at all abated, or their hopes lessened by the Kirk's famous obstacle of matrimony. You have heard how the devout minister of Tynwald had a fair son carried away and bedded against his liking to an unchristened bride whom the elves and the fairies provided. You have heard how the bonny bride of the drunken laird of Selkirtup was stolen by the fairies out at the back window of the bridal chamber the time the bridegroom was groping his way to the chamber door, and you have heard— But why need I multiply cases? Such things in the ancient days were as common as candlelight. So you'll no hinder certain water elves and sea fairies, who sometimes keep festival and summer mirth in these old haunted hulks, from falling in love with the weel-fared wife of Lord Macharg. And to their plots and contrivances they went, how they might accomplish to sunder man and wife. And sundering such a man and such a wife was like sundering the green leaf from the summer, or the fragrance from the flower. So it fell on a time that Laird Macharg took his half-net on his back, and his steel spear in his hand, and down to Blauhooly Bay gate he, and into the water he went, right between the 2 haunted hulks, and placing his net away to the coming of the tide. The night, ye maun ken, was murk, and the wind lone, and the singing of the increasing waters among the shells and the pebbles was heard for sundry miles. All at once, lights began to glance and twinkle on board the 2 haunted ships from every hole and seam, and presently the sound as of a hatchet employed in squaring timber echoed far and wide. But
if the toil of these unearthly workmen amazed the laird, how much more was his amazement increased when a sharp, shrill voice called out, "Ho, brother, what are you doing now?" A voice still shriller responded from the other haunted ship, "I am making a wife to Sandy Macharg." And a loud, quavering laugh running from ship to ship and from bank to bank told the joy they expected from their labour. Now the laird, besides being a devout and a God-fearing man, was shrewd and bold, and in plot and contrivance and skill in conducting his designs was fairly an overmatch for any of a dozen land elves. But the water elves are far more subtle, and besides, their haunts and their dwellings being in the great deep, pursuit and detection is hopeless if they succeed in carrying their prey to the waves. But ye shall hear. Home flew the laird, collected his family round the hearth, spoke of the signs and sins of the times, and talked of mortification and prayer for averting calamity, and finally, taking his father's Bible, brass clasps, black print, and covered with fine calfskin, from the shelf, he proceeded without let or stint to perform domestic worship. I should have told you that he bolted and locked the door, shut up all inlet to the house, threw salt into the fire, and proceeded in every way like a man skilful in guarding against the plots of fairies and fiends. His wife looked on all this with wonder, but she saw something in her husband's looks that hindered her from intruding either question or advice, and a wise woman was she. Near the mid-hour of the night, the rush of a horse's feet was heard, and the sound of a rider leaping from its back, and a heavy knock came to the door, accompanied by a voice saying, "The cummer drinks hot, and the knave bairn is expected at Lord Lowry's tonight, so mount, good wife, and come." "Preserve me," said the wife of Sandy Macharg. "That's news indeed. Who could have thought it? The laird has been airless for 17 years. Now, Sandy, my man, fetch me my skirt and hood." But he laid his arm round his wife's neck and said, "If all the lairds in Galway go airless, over this door threshold shall ye not stir tonight. And I have said, and I have sworn it, seek not to know why or wherefore, but Lord, send us thy blessed moonlight." The wife looked for a moment in her husband's eyes, and desisted from further entreaty. "But let us send a civil message to the gossips, Sandy, and hadna ye better say I'm sair laid with a sudden sickness, though it's sinful like to send the poor messenger a mile agate with a lie in his mouth without a glass of brandy." "To such a messenger, and to those who sent him, no apology is needed," said the austere laird. "So let him depart." And the clatter of a horse's hoofs was heard, and the muttered imprecations of its rider on the churlish treatment he had experienced. "No, Sandy, my lad," said his wife, laying an arm particularly white and round about his neck as she spoke. "Are you not a queer man and a stern? I have been your wedded wife now these 3 years, and besides my dower, I have brought you 3 as bonny bairns as ever smiled beneath a summer sun. Oh, man, you were deuce a man, and fitter to be an elder even than Willie Greer himself. I have the minister's ain word for it, to put on these hard-hearted looks, and gan waving your arms that way, as if you said, I winna take the counsel of sic a hempie as you. I'm your ain leal wife, and will and maun have an explanation." To all this Sandy Macharg replied, "It is written, wives, obey your husbands, but we have been staying in our devotion, so let us pray." And down he knelt. His wife knelt also, for she was as devout as bonny, and beside them knelt their household, and all lights were extinguished. "Now this beats muttered his wife to herself. "However, I shall be obedient for a time. But if I dinna ken what all this is for before the morn by sunket time, my tongue is nae longer a tongue, nor my hands worth wearing." The voice of her husband in prayer interrupted this mental soliloquy, and ardently did he beseech to be preserved from the wiles of the fiends and the snares of Satan, from witches, ghosts, goblins, elves, fairies, spunkies, and water kelpies, from the spectre ship of Solway, from spirits visible and invisible, from the haunted ships and their unearthly tenants, from maritime spirits that plotted against godly men who fell in love with their wives. Nay, but his presence be near us, said his wife in a low tone of dismay. God guide my goodman's wits, I never heard such a prayer from human lips before. But Sandy, my man, Lord's sake, rise! What fearful light is this? Barn and byre and stable maun be in a blaze, and Hawkey and Hurley, Doddy and Sherry and Dansenplum will be smored in reek and scorched with flame. And a flood of light, but not so gross as a common fire, which ascended to heaven and filled all the court before the house, amply justified the good wife's suspicions. But to the terrors of fire, Sandy was immovable as he was to the imaginary groans of the barren wife of Laird Lowry, and he held his wife and threatened the weight of his right hand, and it was a heavy one, to all who ventured abroad or even unbolted the door. The neighing and prancing of horses and the bellowing of cows augmented the horrors of the night, and to anyone who only heard the din, it seemed that the whole Onstead was in a blaze, and horses and cattle perishing in the flame. All wiles, common or extraordinary, were put in practice to entice or force the honest farmer and his wife to open the door. And when the like success attended every new stratagem, silence for a little while ensued, and a long, loud, and shrilling laugh wound up the dramatic efforts of the night. In the morning, when Laird Macharg went to the door, he found standing against one of the pilasters a piece of black ship oak, rudely fashioned into something like a human form, and which skilful people declared would have been clothed with seeming flesh and blood, and palmed upon him by elfin adroitness for his wife, had he admitted his visitants. A synod of wise men and women sat upon the woman of timber, and she was finally ordered to be devoured by fire, and that in the open air. A fire was soon made, and into it the elfin sculpture was tossed from the prongs of 2 pairs of pitchforks. The blaze that arose was awful to behold, and hissings and burstings and loud cracklings and strange noises were heard in the midst of the flame. And when the whole sank into ashes, a drinking cup of some precious metal was found, and this cup, fashioned no doubt by elfin skill, but rendered harmless by the purification with fire, the sons and daughters of Sandy Macharg and his wife drink out of to this very day. Bless all bold men, say I, and obedient wives. The best. Is my soul tamed and baby-rid with the thought that flood or field can render back to scare men and the moon the airy shapes of the courses they enwomb? And what if 'tis so? Shall I lose the crown of my most golden hope, 'cause its fair circle is haunted by a shadow? From the coast of Cumberland, the beautiful old castle of Carlaverock is seen standing on a point of a fine green promontory, bounded by the river Nith on one side, by the deep sea on the other, by the almost impassable morass of the Solway on the third, while, far beyond, you observe the 3 spires of Dumfries and the high green hills of Dalswinton and Keir. It was formerly the residence of the almost princely names of Douglas, Seaton, Kirkpatrick, and Maxwell. It is now the dwelling place of the hawk and the owl. Its courts are a lair for cattle, and its walls afford a midnight shelter to the passing smuggler, or, like those of the city doomed in Scripture, are places for the fishermen to dry their nets. Between this fine old ruin and the banks of the Nith, at the foot of a grove of pines, and within a stone cast of the tide mark, there remains a rude cottage yet visible to the curious eye. The bramble and the wild plum have in vain tried to triumph over the huge grey granite blocks which compose the foundation of its walls. The vestiges of a small garden may still be traced, more particularly in summer, when roses and lilies and other relics of its former beauty begin to open their bloom, clinging, amid the neglect and desolation of the place, with something like human affection to the soil. This rustic ruin presents no attractions to the eye of the profound antiquary compared to those of its more stately companion, Carlaverock Castle.
but with this rude cottage and its garden, tradition connects a tale so wild and so moving as to elevate it in the contemplation of the peasantry above all the princely feasts and feudal atrocities of its neighbour. It is now some 50 years since I visited the parish of Carlaverock, but the memory of its people, its scenery, and the story of the ghost with the golden casket are as fresh with me as matters of yesterday. I had walked out to the river bank one sweet afternoon of July, when the fishermen were hastening to dip their nets in the coming tide, and the broad waters of the Solway Sea were swelling and leaping against bank and cliff as far as the eye could reach. It was studded over with boats, and its more unfrequented bays were white with waterfowl. I sat down on a small grassy mound between the cottage ruins and the old garden plot, and gazed, with all the hitherto untasted pleasure of a stranger, on the beautiful scene before me. On the right, and beyond the river, the mouldering relics of the ancient religion of Scotland ascended in unassimilating beauty above the humble kirk of New Abbey and its squalid village. Further to the south rose the white, sharp cliffs of Barnhoorie, while on the left stood the ancient keeps of Cumlogan and Torthorald and the castle of Carlaverock. Over the whole looked the stately green mountain of Criffel, confronting its more stately but less beautiful neighbour, Skiddaw, while between them flowed the deep, wide sea of Solway, hemmed with cliff and castle and town. As I sat, looking on the increasing multitudes of waters and watching the success of the fishermen, I became aware of the approach of an old man, leading, as one will conduct a dog on a string, a fine young milk cow on a halter of twisted hair, which, passing through the ends of 2 pieces of flat wood fitted to the animal's cheekbones, pressed her nose and gave her great pain whenever she became disobedient. The cow seemed willing to indulge the luxury of a browse on the rich pasture which surrounded the little ruined cottage, but in this humble wish she was not to be indulged, for the aged owner, coiling up the tether and seizing her closely by the head, conducted her past the tempting herbage toward a small and close-cropped hillock a good stone-cast distant. In this piece of self-denial the animal seemed reluctant to sympathize. She snuffed the fresh green pasture and plunged and startled and nearly broke away. What the old man's strength seemed nearly unequal to was accomplished by speech. bonny lady," said he in a soothing tone. "It canna be, it maunna be, hinny. What would become of my 3 bonny grandbairns, made fatherless and mitherless by that false flood of ours, if they supped milk and tasted butter that came from the green sward of this doomed and unblessed spot?" The animal appeared to comprehend something in her own way from the speech of her owner. She abated her resistance, and, indulging only in a passing glance at the rich, deep herbage, passed on to her destined pasture. I had often heard of the singular superstitions of the Scottish peasantry, and that every hillock had its song, every hill its ballad, and every valley its tale. I followed with my eye the old man and his cow. He went but a little way, till, seating himself on the ground, retaining still the tether in his hand, he said, "Now, bonny lady, feast thy fill on this good greensward. It is halesome and holy compared to the sword of the doomed cottage of old Gibbie Grape. Leave that to smugglers' nags. Willie O'Brandyburn and Rolling Lock o' Kempstain will call the haunted hall his hind bit. They are godless fear-nots." I looked at the person of the peasant. He was a stout, hale old man, with a weather-beaten face, furrowed something by time, and, perhaps, by sorrow. Though summer was at its warmest, he wore a broad, checkered mantle, fastened at the bosom with a skewer of steel. A broad bonnet, from beneath the circumference of which straggled a few thin locks, as white as driven snow, shining like amber, and softer than the finest flax, while his legs were warmly cased in blue-ribbed boot-hose. Having laid his charge to the grass, he looked leisurely around him, and, espying me, a stranger, and dressed above the manner of the peasantry, he acknowledged my presence by touching his bonnet, and, as if willing to communicate something of importance, he struck the tether stake in the ground, and came to the old garden fence. Wishing to know the peasant's reasons for avoiding the ruins, I thus addressed him. "This is a pretty spot, my aged friend, and the herbage looks so fresh and abundant that I would advise thee to bring thy charge hither, and, while she continued to browse, I would gladly listen to the history of thy white locks, for they seem to have been bleached in many tempests." "Aye, aye," said the peasant, shaking his white head with a grave smile. "They have braved sundry tempests between 16 and 60, but touching this pasture, sir, I know nobody who would like their cows to crop it. The aged cattle shun the place, the bushes bloom but bear no fruit, the birds never build in the branches, the children never come near to play, and the aged never choose it for a resting place, but, pointing it out as they pass to the young, tell them the story of its desolation. So you see, sir, having no goodwill to such a spot of earth myself, I like little to see a stranger sitting in such an unblessed place, and would good as advise ye to come over with me to the cowslip knoll. There are reasons many that an honest man should nae sit there." I arose at once, and, seating myself beside the peasant on the cowslip knoll, desired to know something of the history of the spot from which he had just warned me. The Caledonian looked on me with an air of embarrassment. "I am just thinking," said he, "that as ye are an Englishman, I should nigh acquaint you with such a story. You'll make it, I'm doubting, a matter of reproach and vaunt when ye gae home, how Willie Borland of Carlaverock told you a tale of Scottish iniquity that cowed all the stories in Southern book or history." The unexpected obstacle was soon removed. "My sage and considerate friend," I said, "I have the blood in my bosom will keep me from revealing such a tale to the scoffer and the scorner. I am something of a Carlaverock man, the grandson of Marion Stoby of Dukedub." The peasant seized my hand. "Marion Stoby! Bonny Marion Stoby of Dukedub, whom I wooed sae sair and loved sae long. Man, I love you for her sake, and well was it for her brow English bridegroom that William Borland, frail and faded now, but strong and in manhood then, was 1,000 miles from Carlaverock, rolling in the salt sea when she was brided. You have the glance of her ee. I could ken it among 10,000, grey as my head is. I will tell the grandson of Bonny Marion Stoby ony tale he likes to ask for, and the story of the ghost in the Golden Casket shall be foremost." "You may imagine, then," said the old Carlaverock peasant, rising at once with the commencement of his story from his native dialect into very passable English, "you may imagine these ruined walls raised again in their beauty, whitened and covered with a coating of green broom, that garden now desolate, filled with herbs in their season, and with flowers, hemmed round with a fence of cherry and plum trees, and the whole possessed by a young fisherman, who won a fair subsistence for his wife and children from the waters of the Solway Sea. You may imagine it, too, as far from the present time as 50 years. There are only 2 persons living now who remember when the Bon Homme Richard, the first ship ever Richard Faulder commanded, was wrecked on the Pellic Sand. One of those persons now addresses you, and the other is the fisherman who once owned that cottage, whose name ought never to be named, and whose life seems lengthened as a warning to the earth how fierce God's judgments are. Life changes. All breathing things have their time and their season, but the Solway flows in the same beauty, Criffel rises in the same majesty, the light of the morning comes, and the full moon arises now as they did then. But this moralizing matters little. It was about the middle of harvest. I remember the day well. It had been sultry and suffocating, accompanied by rushings of wind, sudden convulsions of the water, and cloudings of the sun. I heard my father sigh and say, "Dole, dole to them found on the deep sea tonight. There will happen strong storm and fearful tempest." The day closed, and the moon came over Skiddaw. All was perfectly clear and still. Frequent dashings and whirling agitations of the sea were soon heard, mingling with the hasty clang of the waterfowl's wings as they forsook the waves and sought shelter among the hollows of the rocks. The storm was nigh. The sky darkened down at once, clap after clap of thunder followed, and lightning flashed so vividly and so frequent that the wide and agitated expanse of Solway was visible from side to side, from St. Bees to Barnhourie. A very heavy rain mingled with hail succeeded, and a wind accompanied it, so fierce and so high that the white foam of the sea was showered as thick as snow on the summit of Carlaverock Castle. Through the perilous sea, and amid this darkness and tempest, a bark was observed coming swiftly down the middle of the seas, her sails rent and her decks crowded with people. The carry, as it is called, of the Tempest was direct from St. Bees to Carlaverock, and experienced swains could see that the bark would soon be driven full on the fatal shoals of the Scottish side. But the lightning was so fierce that few dared to venture to look on the approaching vessel, or take measures for endeavoring to preserve the lives of the unfortunate mariners. My father stood on the threshold of his door and beheld all that passed in the bosom of the sea. The bark approached fast, her canvases rent to threads, her masts nearly leveled with the deck, and the sea foaming over her so deep and so strong as to threaten to sweep the remains of her crew from the little refuge the broken masts and splintered beams still afforded them. She now seemed within a half-mile of the shore, when a strong flash of lightning that appeared to hang over the bark for a moment showed the figure of a lady, richly dressed, clinging to a youth who was pressing her to his bosom. My father exclaimed, "Saddle me my black horse, and saddle me my grey, and bring them down to the dead man's bank." And, swift in action as he was in resolve, he hastened to the shore, his servants following with his horses. The shore of Solway presented then, as it does now, the same varying line of coast, and the house of my father stood in the bosom of a little bay nearly a mile from where we sit. The remains of an old forest interposed between the bay at Dead Man's Bank and the bay at our feet, and mariners had learned to wish that if it were their doom to be wrecked, it might be in the bay of Douce William Borland rather than that of Gilbert Grape, the proprietor of that ruined cottage. But human wishes are vanities, wished either by sea or by land. I have heard my father say he could never forget the cries of the mariners as the bark smote on the Pellic bank and the flood rushed through the chasms made by the concussions, but he would far less forget the agony of a lady, the loveliest that could be looked upon, and the calm and affectionate courage of the young man who supported her and endeavored to save her from destruction. Richard Faulder, the only man who survived, has often sat at my fireside and sung me a very rude but very moving ballad which he made on this young and unhappy pair, and the old mariner assured me that he had only added rhymes and a descriptive line or two to the language in which Sir William Musgrave endeavored to soothe and support his wife. It seemed a thing truly singular that at this very moment 2 young fishermen, who sat on the margin of the sea below us, watching their have-nets, should sing, and with much sweetness, the very song the old man had described. They warbled verse and verse alternately, and rock and bay seemed to retain and then release the sound. Nothing is so sweet as a song by the seaside on a tranquil evening. Sir William Musgrave. First Fisherman. O lady, lady, why do you weep? Though the wind be loosed on the raging deep, though the heaven be murker than murk may be, and our frail bark ships a fearful sea, yet thou art safe as on that sweet night when our bridal candles gleamed fair and bright. There came a shriek, and there came a sound, and the Solway roared, and the ship spun round. Second Fisherman. O lady, lady, why do you cry? Though the waves be flashing topmast high, though our frail bark yields to the dashing brine, and heaven and earth show no saving sign, there is one who comes in the time of need, and curbs the waves as we curb a steed. The lightning came with the whirlwind blast, and cleaved the prow, and smote down the mast. First Fisherman. O lady, lady, weep not nor wail, though the sea runs how as Dalswinton vale, then flashes high as Barnhoorie brave, and yawns for thee like the yearning grave. Though twixt thee and the ravening flood there is but my arm and this splintering wood, the fell quicksand or the famished brine can ne'er harm a face as fair as thine. Both. O lady, lady, be bold and brave, spread thy white breast to the fearful wave, and cling to me with that white right hand, I'll set thee safe on good dry land. A lightning flash on the shallop strook, The Solway roared, and Carlaverock shook. From the sinking ship there were shriekings cast that were heard above the tempest's blast. The young fishermen having concluded their song, my companion proceeded. The lightning still flashed vivid and fast, and the storm raged with unabated fury, for between the ship and the shore the sea broke in frightful undulation and leapt on the greensward several fathoms deep abreast. My father, mounted on one horse and holding another in his hand, stood prepared to give all the aid that a brave man could to the unhappy mariners, but neither horse nor man could endure the onset of that tremendous surge. The bark bore for a time the fury of the element, but a strong eastern wind came suddenly upon her, and, crushing her between the wave and the freestone bank, drove her from the entrance of my father's little bay toward the dwelling of Gibbie Grape. And the thick forest intervening, she was out of sight in a moment. My father saw for the last time the lady and her husband looking shoreward from the side of the vessel as she drifted along, and as he galloped around the head of the forest, he heard for the last time the outcry of some and the wail and intercession of others. When he came before the fisherman's house, a fearful sight presented itself. The ship, dashed to atoms, covered the shore with its wreck and with the bodies of mariners. Not a living soul escaped, save Richard Faulder, whom the fiend who guides the spectre shallop of Solway had rendered proof to perils on the deep. The fisherman himself came suddenly from his cottage, all dripping and drenched, and my father addressed him, "Oh, Gilbert, Gilbert, what a fearful sight is this! Has heaven blessed thee with making thee the means of saving a human soul?" "Nor soul nor body have I saved," said the fisherman doggedly. "I have done my best. The storm proved too stark, and the lightning too fierce for me. Their boat alone came near with a lady and a casket of gold, but she was swallowed up with the surge." My father confessed afterward that he was touched with the tone in which these words were delivered, and made answer, "If thou hast done thy best to save souls tonight, a bright reward will be thine. If thou hast been fonder for gain than for working the mariner's redemption, thou hast much to answer for." As he uttered these words, an immense wave rolled landward as far as the place where they stood. It almost left its foam on their faces, and, suddenly receding, deposited at their feet the dead body of the lady. As my father lifted her in his arms, he observed that the jewels which had adorned her hair, at that time worn long, had been forcibly rent away. The diamonds and gold that encircled her neck and ornamented the bosom of her rich satin dress had been torn off, the rings removed from her fingers, and on her neck, lately so lily-white and pure, there appeared to be the marks of hands, not laid there in love and gentleness, but with a fierce and deadly grasp. The lady was buried with the body of her husband, side by side, in Carlaverock burial ground. My father never openly accused Gilbert the fisherman of having murdered the lady for her riches as she reached the shore, preserved, as was supposed, from sinking by her long, wide, and stiff satin robes. But from that hour till the hour of his death, my father never broke bread with him, never shook him or his by the hand, nor spoke with them, in wrath or in love. The fisherman from that time, too, waxed rich and prosperous, and, from being the needy proprietor of a have-net and the tenant at will of a rude cottage, he became, by purchase, lord of a handsome inheritance, proceeded to build a bonny mansion, and called it Grape Ha, and became a leading man in a flock of a pure kind of Presbyterians, and a precept and example to the community. Though the portioner of Grape Ha prospered wondrously, his claims to parochial distinction and the continuance of his fortune were treated with scorn by many, and with doubt by all. Though nothing open or direct was said, looks, more cutting at times than the keenest speech, and actions still more expressive, showed that the hearts of honest men were alienated. The cause was left to his own interpretation. The peasant scrupled to become his servant. Sailors hesitated to receive his grain on board, lest peril should find them on the deep. The beggar ceased to solicit alms. The drover and horse-crouper, an unscrupling generation, found out a more distant mode of concluding bargains than by shaking his hand. His daughters, handsome and blue-eyed, were neither wooed nor married, No maiden would hold tryst with his sons, though maidens were then as little loth as they are now, and the aged peasant, as he passed his new mansion, would shake his head and say, "The voice of spilt blood will be lifted up against thee, and a spirit shall come from the waters, will make the cornerstone of thy habitation tremble and quake." It happened during the summer which succeeded this unfortunate shipwreck that I accompanied my father to the Solway to examine his nets. It was near midnight. The tide was making, and I sat down by his side and watched the comings of the waters. The shore was glittering in starlight as far as the eye could reach. Gilbert, the fisherman, had that morning removed from his cottage to his new mansion. The former was, therefore, untenanted, and the latter, from its vantage ground on the crest of the hill, threw down to us the sound of mirth and music and dancing, a revelry common in Scotland on taking possession of a new house. As we lay quietly looking on the swelling sea and observing the waterfall swimming and ducking in the increasing waters, the sound of the merriment became more audible. My father listened to the mirth, looked to the sea, looked to the deserted cottage, and then to the new mansion, and said, "My son, I have a counsel to give thee. Treasure it in thy heart, and practice it in thy life. The daughters of him of grape ha are fair, and have an eye that would while away the wits of the wisest. Their father has wealth. I say naught of the way he came by it. They will have golden portions doubtless. But I would rather lay thy head aneath the gowans on Carlaverock kirkyard, and son have I none beside thee, than see thee lay it on the bridal pillow with the begotten of that man, though she had Nithsdale for her dowry. Let not my words be as seed sown on the ocean. I may not now tell thee why this warning is given. Before that fatal shipwreck, I would have said that Prudence Grape in her castle was a better bride than some who have golden dowers. I have long thought that someone would see a sight, and often, while holding my have-net in the moonlight tide, I have looked for something to appear. For, where blood is shed, there doth the spirit haunt for a time, and give warning to man. May I be strengthened to endure the sight." I answered not, being accustomed to regard my father's counsel as a matter not to be debated, as a solemn command. We heard something like the rustling of wings on the water, accompanied by a slight curling motion of the tide. "God bowed his right hand about us," said my father, breathing thick with emotion and awe, and looking out on the sea with a gaze so intense that his eyes seemed to dilate and the hair of his forehead to project forward and bristle into life. I looked, but observing nothing save a long line of thin and quavering light dancing along the surface of the sea. It ascended the bank on which it seemed to linger for a moment, and then, entering the fisherman's cottage, made roof and rafter gleam with sudden illumination. "I'll tell thee what, Gibby Grape," said my father. "I would now be the owner of thy heart and the proprietor of thy right hand for all the treasures of earth and ocean." A loud and piercing scream from the cottage made us thrill with fear, and in a moment the figures of 3 human beings rushed into the open air and ran toward us with a swiftness which supernatural dread alone could inspire. We instantly knew them to be 3 noted smugglers who infested the country, and, rallying when they found my father maintain his ground, they thus mingled their fears and the secrets of their trade, for terror fairly overpowered their habitual caution. "I vow by the night tide and the crooked timber," said Willie Wheathouse, "I never beheld sic a light as yon since our distillation pipe took fire, and made a burnt instead of a drink offering of our spirits. I'll uphold it comes for Nygoat, a warning may be. Say ye may go on, Willie Bouthouse way, with your wickedness. As for me, I's go home and repent." "Soulless body," said his companion, whose natural hardihood was considerably supported by his communion with the brandy cup. "Soulless body for a flaff of fire and a maiden shadda, would ye forswear the gallant trade? Sound to good. But old Miller Morrison shall turn your thrapple into a drain pipe to wise the wastewater from his mill if ye turn back now and help us nigh through with the strongest importation as ever cheered the throat and cheaped in the crapin'. Confound the fizzonless body. He glowers as if this fine starlight were something for the worst side of the world, and thee staring e'en of his busy shape in heaven's sweetest and balmiest air into the figures of wraiths and goblins. Robert Telfer, said my father, addressing the third smuggler, tell me not of your secrets of your perilous craft, but tell me what you have seen and why you uttered that fearful scream that made the wood doves start from Carlaverock pines. I'll tell you what, good man, said the mariner. I have seen the fires of heaven running as thick along the sky and on the surface of the ocean as you ever saw the blaze on a bowl or a punch at merrymaking, and neither quaked nor screamed. But you'll mind the light that came into that cottage tonight was one for some fearful purport, which, let the wise expound, say it lessened nigh one's courage to quail for sick an apparition. Odd! If I'd thought living soul would ever make the start I'd gied an upcast to me, I'd drill his breastbane with my dirk like some turnip lantern. My father mollified the wrath of this maritime desperado by assuring him that he beheld the light go from the sea to the cottage, and that he shook with terror, for it seemed no common light. "Ha! Good then," said hopeful Robin. "Since it was one of our ain Kenny's sea apparitions, I care less about it. I took it for some landward sprite, and now I think on it, where were my een? Did it no stand among its ain light, with its long hanks of hair dripping and drenched, with a casket of gold in ae hand, and the other guarding its throat? I'll be bound it's the ghost of some sonsy lass that has had her neck nipped for her gold, and had she stayed till I emptied the bicker of brandy, I would have asked a canny question or tway." Willie Waithouse had now fairly overcome his consternation, and began to feel all his love for the gallant trade, as his comrade called it, return. "The tide serves, lads, the tide serves. Let us slip our drape of brandy in the bit bonny boat, and toddle away among the sweet starlight as far as the King Holm or the town quarry. You ken we have to meet the Ballygardevine and Laird Sir Carsey of Ladomouth." They returned, not without hesitation and fear, to the old cottage, carried their brandy to the boat, and, as my father and I went home, we heard the dipping of their oars in the Nith, along the banks of which they sold their liquor and told their tale of fear, magnifying its horror at every step and introducing abundance of variations. The story of the ghost with the golden casket flew over the countryside with all its variations and with many comments. Some said they saw her, and some thought they saw her, and those who had the hardihood to keep watch on the beach at midnight had their tales to tell of terrible lights and strange visions. With one who delighted in the marvellous, the spectre was decked with attributes that made the circle of auditors tighten round the hearth, while others, who allowed the ghost only a certain quantity of thin air to clothe itself in, reduced it in their description to a very unpoetic shadow, or a kind of better sort of will-o'-the-wisp that could for its own amusement counterfeit the human shape. There were many who, like my father, beheld the singular illumination appear at midnight on the coast, saw also something sailing along with it in the form of a lady in bright garments, her hair long and wet and shining in diamonds, and heard a struggle and the shriek as of a creature drowning. The belief of the peasantry did not long confine the apparition to the sea coast. It was seen sometimes late at night far inland, and following Gilbert the fisherman, like a human shadow, like a pure light, like a white garment, and often in the shape and with the attributes which had disturbed the carousel of smugglers. I heard Douce Davy Haining, a God-fearing man and an elder of the burgher congregation, and on whose word I could well lippen when drink was kept from his head, I heard him say that as he rode home late from the rude fair of Dumfries, the night was dark, there lay a dusting of snow on the ground, and no one appeared on the road but himself. He was lilting and singing the canny end of the old song, "There's a cutty stool in our kirk," which was made on some foolish queen's misfortune, when he heard the sound of horses' feet behind him at full gallop, and ere he could look around, who should flee past, urging his horse with whip and spur, but Gilbert the fisherman. "Little wonder that he galloped," said the elder, "for a fearful form hovered round him, making many a clutch at him, and with every clutch uttering a shriek most piercing to hear." But why should I make a long story of a common tale? The curse of spilt blood fell on him, and on his children, and all he possessed. His sons and daughters died, his flocks perished, his grain grew but never filled the ear, and fire came from heaven or rose from hell, and consumed his house and all that was therein. He is now a man of 90 years, a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, without a house to put his white head in, with the unexpiated curse still clinging to him. While my companion was making this summary of human wretchedness, I observed the figure of a man stooping to the earth with extreme age, gliding through among the bushes of the ruined cottage and approaching the advancing tide. He wore a loose great coat, patched to the ground and fastened around his waist by a belt and buckle. The remains of stockings and shoes were on his feet. A kind of fisherman's cap surmounted some remaining white hairs, and a long peeled stick supported him as he went. My companion gave an involuntary shudder when he saw him. Lo and behold, now here comes Gilbert the fisherman. Once every 24 hours doth he come, let the wind and rain be as they will, to the nightly tide, to work o'er again in imagination his old tragedy of unrighteousness. See how he waves his hand as if he welcomed someone from sea. He raises his voice too, as if something in the water required his counsel, and see how he dashes up the middle and grapples with the water as if he clutched a human being. I looked on the old man and heard him call in a hollow and broken voice, "Oh, oi, the ship! Oh, oi, turn your boat's head ashore, and my bonny lady, keep bowed o' your casket. Hecht, be it that wave would have sunk a 3-decker, let be a slender boat. See, and she been a-sailing aboon the water like a wild swan." And, wading deeper in the tide as he spoke, he seemed to clutch at something with both hands and struggle with it in the water. Na, dinna hand your white hands to me. You wear oud mickle gowd in your hair, and many diamonds on your bosom to scape drowning. There's as mickle gowd in this casket as would have sunk thee 70 fathom deep. And as he continued to hold his hands under the water, muttering all the while, "She's half gone now, and I'll be a brow laird and build a bonny house and gang crousely to kirk and market. Now I may let the waves work their will, my work will be taken for theirs." He turned to wade to the shore, but a large and heavy wave came full dash on him and bore him off his feet, and ere any assistance reached him, all human aid was too late. For nature was so exhausted with the fullness of years and with his exertions that a spoonful of water would have drowned him. The body of this miserable old man was interred, after some opposition from the peasantry, beneath the wall of the kirkyard, and from that time the ghost with the golden casket was seen no more, and only continued to haunt the evening tale of the hind and the farmer.